When a broken arm back in Chattanooga and an ice storm conspire to delay your Hawaiian luxury blitz, the only rational response is to eat at Nobu 3 times in a single day once you finally arrive. Welcome to Chapter 10, Gilded Lānaʻi, Grounded by a Cast, where Four Seasons Suites, a Botero sculpture mid-refinishing, and a parrot exhibit share the itinerary with a World War II concrete shipwreck and a cat sanctuary born from Maui's misfortunes. The gilding runs thick on this island, but the ground beneath it keeps insisting on a longer, messier story. Even as the red dust of Lānaʻi settled on our luggage, the universe decided to remind me that geography is no defense against biology. My phone vibrated with a call from my sister. She delivered exactly the sort of news that instantly collapses the distance between a tropical paradise and a YMCA in the middle of an ice storm in Tennessee. My 12-year-old son, currently back home, had slipped and broken his arm. We immediately lost an entire day to the specific brand of helpless, worrying parents excel at. While our bodies were ostensibly in the Pacific, our minds were trapped in a massive ice storm in Chattanooga, unable to do a thing. 48 hours later, the ice back home thawed, the cast was set, and our vacation finally started moving again. Leaving earlier would not have made a difference, strictly speaking, but logic rarely stops a parent from stressing. The following day improved significantly. This was largely because we returned to the primary selling point of Hawaii, which is that it is distinctly not Chattanooga, Tennessee. We set about making up for lost time with a level of gluttony that bordered on competitive sport. Relying on a global sushi conglomerate for 3 consecutive meals might indicate a lack of culinary imagination, or perhaps a dangerous abundance of mercury, but I prefer to view it as commitment. We inadvertently pulled a culinary hat-trick by eating at Nobu 3 separate times in a single day. We had Nobu for breakfast, yes, that is a thing here, Nobu for lunch, and then, just to keep the streak alive, Nobu for dinner over at the beach resort. In the interim, somewhere between courses of yellowtail that cost more than my first car, I had a brief chat with the fellow responsible for maintaining the estate's artwork. He engaged me in a riveting tale about stripping one of the volumetric Botero sculptures down to the bare metal. He apparently preferred the raw, coppery look, favoring a rustic, aesthetic choice. The estate required him to apply a specific lacquer paint on top of it anyway. This was all done naturally with the estate's permission, because one does not simply rouge a Botero without filling out the proper paperwork. We transferred over to the beach resort in a Tesla Model X. The vehicle arrived equipped with rear doors that open upward like a bird asking for a hug. Scissor doors is not the correct term. Falcon wings, perhaps. Regardless of the exact marketing label, they are the specific type of doors that scream future while simultaneously threatening to clip a low ceiling. The ride was smooth, offering a clear view of the road stretching between Lānaʻi City and the coast. Up in the city grid, where the Central Park provides a boundary for the Sensei Resort, the administrative routes of the island remain highly visible. The Heritage and Culture Center occupies a government building that technically used to be the Dole administration offices. That was back when pineapples were the dictators of this island. Lānaʻi City was not always the capital. Places like Lopa and Kaunolu held that title at one point or another, long before the fruit took charge. Before heading further down toward the sand, I struck up a conversation with a local resident. He explained the bizarre economic reality of living on a billionaire's private island, where logistics are handled with the efficiency of a moon landing and carry a matching price tag. Residents frequently take the main ferry back and forth to Maui simply to avoid buying toilet paper locally. He claimed it was $25 for a pack. Later, I checked the store to verify this rumor, and he was wrong. It was $35. It was just the Kirkland brand from Costco, marked up with a level of audacity that one almost has to admire. With that baseline of island economics firmly established, our electric vehicle carried us the rest of the way to the coast and the impending sunset. Synthwave sunset at Nobu and Waikiki. Safe from the economic horrors of the local grocery store, we breached the coastal sanctuary of the resort. The staff immediately upgraded us to a suite. I initially attributed this to the divine intervention of the American Express Fine Hotels and Resorts program, but I prefer to believe the universe was finally balancing the ledger. The previous 24 hours of helpless parental panic back in Tennessee had ostensibly generated a specific frequency of desperation that hotel managers can smell. It was a devastating emotional setback that I could now exchange, paradoxically, for the currency of high thread count sheets and panoramic ocean views. We settled into a room where the sunset view was so aggressive it felt like the sky was showing off. The staff had left a welcome cake so artistically rendered that eating it felt like vandalism. The grounds surrounding us were immaculate. Walkways hovered above the earth, creating courtyards lush with waterfalls. It is a landscape that looks entirely organic and natural, assuming nature comes equipped with a landscaping crew and a generous irrigation budget. Stepping outside to tour the estate, we discovered a new installation by Damien Hirst. Hirst is a British artist who achieved notoriety in the 1990s by suspending a tiger shark in formaldehyde, and he has apparently not lost his affinity for marine violence. His bronze sculpture depicts a giant kraken wrestling a shark that is simultaneously eating a boat, or some similarly chaotic variation of the ocean food chain. It looks insane, which tracks perfectly for the artist. Nearby, the resort juxtaposes this modern absurdity with historical reality, displaying Cold War implements alongside Polynesian war tools. The ancient Hawaiians, it turns out, possessed a keen understanding of how to fashion a wooden battle axe that could effectively ruin an enemy's afternoon. At dusk, a conch shell bellowed across the property to signal the start of the hula performance. It was a lovely display. The dancers moved with a fluidity that I decided was reminiscent of Okinawan dance, largely because that is the only other cultural dance reference remaining in my mental catalogue. The local wildlife turned out in force for the show. Gold dust geckos, skinks and anoles scurried across the rocks, suggesting that even lizards appreciate free entertainment. I even spotted a common house gecko looking surprisingly comfortable in the great outdoors. Dinner was, naturally, back at Nobu. We had clearly not surrendered enough of our net worth to them earlier in the day up in the city. We ordered the Wagyu sliders, through some sort of dark culinary sorcery which I suspect was just very expensive ketchup. These high-end creations tasted exactly like the best McDonald's hamburgers ever made. It felt like an elaborate conceptual art piece where the chef dares you to pay a fortune for the memory of a happy meal. They even branded the top of the buns with the word Nobu, literally burning the corporate logo into the bread just in case the fast food flavor profile made us forget who currently owned us. Beyond the restaurants, the resort maintains a collection of exotic birds. The aviaries hold macaws and a grey parrot that speaks, alongside a cockatoo that allegedly dances. I say allegedly because the bird did not appreciate my rendition of Happy Birthday. It evaluated me with the cold, dead eyes of a disappointed talent scout and flatly refused to dance. Everyone is a critic. The next morning, nature offered a scenic apology for the bird's rudeness. We watched whales breaching right off our balcony while a school of porpoises, likely spinner dolphins, played in the nearby surf. Ready to explore beyond the property, we rented a jeep. It was a pristine machine with fewer than 400 miles on the gauge. We fired it up and headed back toward the island center for lunch. Leaving the coast, the contrast between the island's two resort hubs became remarkably clear. If the high-altitude retreat back up the hill was a track of ambient yoga music designed to put you to sleep, this sprawling beach resort was a pounding, neon-soaked synthwave anthem. Lānaʻi, dolphins, and Sweetheart Rock. As our cleanly rented Jeep wound its way uphill, I took a moment to properly process the high-fidelity stage set falling away in the rearview mirror. The Four Seasons resort Lānaʻi occupies the southeastern coast at Manele Bay, perched atop red lava cliffs that look significantly more jagged and dramatic than anything a liability insurance adjuster would usually approve. Originally opened in 1991 as the Manele Bay Hotel, the property was subjected to a comprehensive renovation and reopened in 2016 following Larry Ellison's purchase of the island. The redesign shifted the corporate identity to a low-density, island-scale flagship, which operates as corporate speak for "we made it look like a very expensive Bond villain's retirement community." The architects utilized stone, wood, and expansive glass to blow open the sightlines to the cliffs, ensuring that no matter where you stand, the ocean is steadily staring right back at you. The property's terraced gardens are a feat of engineering, featuring walkways that appear to hover over the earth to bridge lush courtyards filled with waterfalls. It projects a violently idyllic aesthetic. The design plausibly suggests the plants abandoned botanical chaos and decided to arrange themselves in perfect geometric harmony without human intervention, assuming nature comes equipped with an unlimited landscape budget. The grounds function as an informal sculpture park, littered with contemporary works intentionally left unlabeled. This lack of signage is presumably an esoteric test meant to separate true art connoisseurs from people who just think a contractor forgot to move a statue. Those scattered pieces include the Damien Hirst installation we observed the day before. I feel compelled to note for the art historians in the audience that this outdoor piece is a bronze or patinated cast, specifically designed to withstand the corrosive salt air. His famous shark in formaldehyde vitrine would likely have turned into a very expensive soup in this tropical heat. Down past the art and the red cliffs lies Hulopoi Bay. The water here falls under a designated marine life conservation district, a protective status that keeps the ecosystem vibrant enough to support the localized population of spinner dolphins we watched over breakfast. True to the brochure, these cetaceans rest in the shallow, calm waters during the day. Despite the exclusivity of the hotel overlooking it, the beach remains legally public. Instead of attempting a privatization scheme, the resort was designed to share the bay, carefully maintaining the snorkeling entry points used by locals for generations. This arrangement creates a curious dynamic where guests paying thousands of dollars a night wade in alongside residents who just drove down for a quick dip, permanently united by the universal struggle of getting sand out of their swimwear. Beyond the Nobu dining room we visited earlier, options expand to a spot called Views down by the golf course. The staff there informed me that the panoramic cliffside vista includes a clear look at Ellison's private residence, just in case a passing guest felt the need to wave to the landlord. For anyone feeling energetic, a coastal path connects the resort to overlooks of Pu'upehe, known locally as Sweetheart Rock, a sea stack steeped in Hawaiian legend. Nearby, the Manele Bay villas operate as privately owned condominiums entirely separate from the hotel's inventory. They strongly suggest that for a highly specific bracket of the population, this echelon of luxury is just a normal Tuesday. I mentally filed away the suspiciously perfect waterfalls and the manicured cliffs, returning my full attention to the road ahead. The resort was undeniably spectacular, but having a bronze shark staring at you while you drink your morning coffee does something to a man's psyche. We left that bougie predator behind, letting the Jeep carry us higher toward the dusty plantation history waiting in the center of the island. Lānaʻi, pineapples, petroglyphs, and firecats. Trading the manicured waterfalls of the coast for a rugged red dirt reality, we steered directly into Lānaʻi City. The grid of plantation-era architecture feels frozen in a decidedly specific regimented operational window. We wandered into the Lānaʻi Culture and Heritage Center, a modest building shouldering the heavy burden of summarizing 1.3 million years of existence. While the center offers a polite nod to the island's geological birth and ancient past, the bulk of the floor space is enthusiastically devoted to the Dole plantation era. It appears that in the local curatorial hierarchy, the geological formation of the Earth ranks a distant second to the industrial optimization of bromeliads. The history of Lānaʻi is a narrative of drastic renovations. Roughly 1.3 million years ago, the island emerged as a shield volcano, eventually joining Maui, Molokai, and Kahoʻolawe to form the super-island Maui Nui. It functioned as a singular landmass until rising sea levels forced a breakup, leaving Lānaʻi in the rain shadow of Maui's mountains. This geography proved fateful. Without the heavy rainfall of its neighbors, the island weathered into a dry, red landscape, limiting human settlement and eventually triggering the sweeping erosion that defines its modern topography. For centuries, the island was rumored to be the domain of aqua ino, or man-eating spirits. That demographic issue was solved only when the exiled chief Kaulua cleared them out. The island later served as a quiet satellite to Maui's political powerhouse, hosting a ritual center and refuge at Kaunalu, where chiefs like Kamehameha I would retreat to fish and govern. The tranquility ended in the mid-19th century when land tenure laws shifted, paving the way for James Dole to purchase nearly the entire island in 1922. Dole constructed Lānaʻi City as a company town, regulating life by the plantation clock and importing workers from across the Pacific, creating a monoculture economy that lasted until the final harvest in 1992. Shifting from the history of fruit to the history of felines, we navigated toward the Lānaʻi Cat Sanctuary. This compound bills itself as a haven for 600 cats. That number sounds like a hypothetical math problem until you are standing in the middle of it. Upon arrival, a staff member corrected the figure to 730, a discrepancy attributed to a recent influx of refugees from the destructive fires on Maui. Seeing the singed fur on some of the survivors offered a sobering check on the inherent absurdity of being surrounded by that many predators, even ones that easily fit into a shoebox. Cats are far from the sole animals roaming the island with a complicated paperwork history. As we drove toward the uplands, we encountered the other distinct residents of the interior, axis deer and wild turkeys. The axis deer were introduced from India in the 1920s, ostensibly treated as a gift. Today they function less like a present and more like a landscaping crew that has gone rogue. Lacking natural predators, they multiplied and stripped away the vegetation that previously held the fragile soil together. They are closely joined by wild turkeys, introduced for sport in the mid-20th century. These birds have adapted to the resort lifestyle with startling ease, often seen loitering near the roads like they are waiting for a valet to bring around a car they do not own. We steered the jeep toward the northwestern corner of the island to witness the result of all that ungulate erosion at Keahayakawelo, commonly translated as the Garden of the Gods. The landscape here vividly illustrates the aesthetic power of geological decay. Wind has stripped the soil down to a hardpan of red and purple volcanic boulders, creating a vista that looks less like Hawaii and more like a terraformed colony on Mars that ran out of funding. Strange orange lichen clings to the rocks, adding to the alien palette. Navigating this terrain required a certain amount of hubris. The road is a narrow, rutted ribbon of red dust, winding through a silent, sacred vastness where ancient spirits purportedly dwell. I felt a profound sense of isolation, a deep connection to the elemental forces that shaped this rock in the middle of the Pacific, right up until I rounded a blind corner and nearly collided with a white jeep identical to my own. Then another, and another. We were not lonely explorers on the frontier. We were mere participants in a bizarre, low-speed parade of tourists, all driving the exact same vehicle, all covered in the same red dust, passing each other with the grim nods of commuters stuck in traffic on the surface of the moon. Descending from the lunar highlands, we rattled our way down to the north shore to visit Shipwreck Beach. The primary draw here is the YOGN-42, a World War II fuel barge that sits rusting on the remote reef. It is made of ferro-concrete. This deliberate material choice suggests the Navy was briefly operating under the theory that if you make a rock shaped like a boat, physics will eventually just give up and let it float. It remains a stubborn artifact of wartime resource scarcity and the durability of bad ideas. Nearby, we hiked to see a line of petroglyphs, tracking ancient carvings depicting dogs, humans, and warriors deeply etched into the stone. While observing the rock face, I spotted a small lizard darting into a crevice. Because nearly half of Hawaii's lizard species are recent invaders, I naturally assumed it was just another interloper. However, it had the dark eyes and sleek build of a snake-eyed skink, a species that likely voyaged here with the early Polynesians. It provided a rare glimpse of a creature possessing a legitimate claim to the history carved on the rocks behind it. Down at the shoreline, the tide pools offered a final spectacle. I watched a cluster of anemone-like organisms engaged in a behavior that can only be accurately described as a synchronized panic. They sat partially submerged, retracting and expanding in a rhythmic, desperate tempo that suggested a complex social hierarchy collapsing under the weight of a sudden, invisible political scandal. To the untrained eye, they were simply feeding in the surge. To the keen observer of natural melodrama, this was clearly a ritualistic expulsion of a disgraced member of the colony, a mute, gelatinous shouting match where the stakes were nothing less than the moral integrity of the intertidal zone, ending only when a wave washed over them and reset their collective memory to zero, leaving us to pack up our own assessments and face the long oceanic gap waiting beyond the beach. Lānaʻi's bitter fruit and Dole's ghost. We left the nervous intertidal organisms behind at the beach and navigated back toward the island's interior. History is merely a list of surprises. Kurt Vonnegut diagnosed the past rather well, and the soil of Hawaii offers a textbook example. Just a short drive away from the oxidized boulders of the northern uplands and the rusted maritime wrecks guarding the shoreline, the dry dirt hides a different sort of residue. Although the pineapple is globally recognized as the mascot of a Hawaiian tropical paradise, the fruit is not actually native to the islands. It originated in South America and arrived modestly during the 19th century, functioning much like an invasive botanical corporate takeover, a foreign entity that quickly rooted itself and conquered the entirely available landscape. The story of the Hawaiian pineapple requires massive landscape engineering and the economic forces that reorganized the archipelago. For over a century, agricultural corporations known as the Big Five heavily dictated the financial destiny of the islands. Cultivating the fruit required bringing the natural terrain under strict mechanical alignment, an ambition that reached its absolute zenith on Lānaʻi. By the middle of the 20th century, the land was transformed into an endless grid of uniform green plants, achieving a layout so universally exact it looked less like a living ecosystem and more like a massive, unroofed factory. Field layouts were continually adjusted simply to match the processing capacity of the cannery, and at its peak, this single island produced a commanding majority of the canned pineapple consumed worldwide. But the massive harvest abruptly ended in 1992. The industry certainly did not collapse due to a sudden global distaste for yellow fruit rings. Instead, the geographic and financial realities of the island finally collided with industrial logic. Lānaʻi is one of the driest inhabited islands in the chain. Expanding the agricultural footprint required pumping water across increasingly long distances, a mandate that steadily inflated operational costs. Decades of aggressive monoculture planting also stripped the fragile soil of nutrients, leaving the plantation heavily dependent on imported fertilizers and narrowing profit margins considerably. Labor economics shifted in tandem. Wages predictably increased, legal protections expanded, and young residents eventually left for newer professional opportunities elsewhere. Meanwhile, corporate executives found it vastly cheaper to grow pineapples in locations like Thailand or Costa Rica, where land was flatter, rainfall was higher, and labor was heavily discounted. A pineapple grown on Lānaʻi had to cross vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean before reaching its primary consumers, an incredibly slow logistical chain that made winning a global price war mathematically impossible. Faced with aging roads and machinery requiring massive reinvestments by the late 1980s, senior executives in distant boardrooms chose a clean exit over subsidizing a high-cost island operation. When the cannery and fields closed down, the company-town structure dissolved almost overnight. The shutdown erased jobs for mechanics, clerks, and shipping workers, triggering a sharp population decline. To fill the economic vacuum, Lānaʻi pivoted decisively to luxury tourism, replacing the pineapple fields with high-end properties and wellness retreats. The primary local export simply transitioned from canned produce to tropical vacations, providing a highly curated layer of sophisticated leisure. Yet the dirt remembers. Today, scattered black plastic sits baked into the red soil across the rugged remnants of this agricultural past. During the decades when the island operated as one continuous farm, this mulch was used extensively to suppress weeds and lock in soil moisture. Fragments of this synthetic polymer remain deeply embedded alongside the marine debris washing up on the remote coast, functioning as a stubborn fossil of the heavy machinery required to manufacture a paradise. We encountered this historical residue perfectly by accident. Attempting to prove our rugged independence, we drove our rented jeep entirely off the designated unpaved trails into the abandoned fields. Almost immediately, the forgotten agricultural plastic fulfilled its latent cosmic purpose. The shredded farm mulch wrapped tightly around the vehicle's axles, locking the wheels in place and ruining our frontier expedition with a cheerful lack of empathy. Kauai, barking sands and borrowed crowns. Looking out across that long oceanic gap waiting beyond the Lānaʻi tide pools, I felt compelled to audit my standing as a Pacific traveler. I have been a devoted student of airline lounge geography, a reckless consumer of minibar cashews, and a brave interpreter of ambiguous road signs. I am also a total failure when it comes to Kauai. I have never set foot on the Garden Isle. I certainly haven't been invited to the privately owned Forbidden Isle of Niihau, mostly because I don't know the Robinson family and suspect they wouldn't like me. I have, however, been all over Oahu, which gives me just enough context to realize what I am missing. Based on the mountain of literature I have consumed to compensate for this glaring resume gap, Kauai is the archipelago's dignified elder. It is defined by geological seniority, stubborn political independence, and a brief, confusing dalliance with the Russian Empire. As the oldest of the main islands, Kauai has been eroding for approximately 5 million years. The process has turned it into a masterpiece of destruction. The landscape is dominated by Waimea Canyon, an abyss so vast it is often called the Grand Canyon of the Pacific. A moniker commonly attributed to Mark Twain because, apparently, he is required to have named everything in the American West. The canyon's immense depth isn't just from the Waimea River chipping away at the rock. Millions of years ago, a massive flank of the volcano simply collapsed, suggesting the island decided early on that being a seamless cone was boring and opted for drama instead. This geologic theatricality continues on the northwest shore with the Napali coast, where fluted sea cliffs rise thousands of feet from the ocean. They are accessible only by boat, helicopter, or the rugged Kalalau Trail, a path cut in the late 1800s for people who find walking on flat ground insufficiently perilous. This isolationist geography matched the island's political history. Kamehameha I spent his career forcefully unifying the chain with cannon fire and sheer will, but he never successfully invaded Kauai. The channels were too rough, and the island's defenders were too prepared. Instead of succumbing to a hostile landing, King Kaumoalii negotiated a diplomatic session in 1810. He recognized that joining the Kingdom of Hawaii voluntarily was preferable to having Kamehameha's fleet parked on his lawn. By talking his way into the Union, Kaumoalii secured his continued authority and spared his people the devastation seen on Oahu and Maui. Sometimes the sharpest weapon in the Pacific is a well-timed conversation. Long before the unification wars, Kauai was the stage for Hawaii's first contact with Europe. Captain James Cook, having been blown off course from Oahu by prevailing winds, made his first recorded landing at Waimea on January 20th, 1778. He traded iron for water and provisions, initiating a transaction that altered the archipelago permanently. The island quickly became a grocery store for the maritime fur trade. In 1787, the High Chief Kaiana boarded a British ship here to travel to China and the Pacific Northwest, becoming the first Hawaiian chief to travel globally. He returned with weapons and knowledge that irrevocably changed island warfare. This contact brought silence as well as noise. Kauai was the last refuge of the Kauai-o-o, a nectar-feeding bird with yellow thigh feathers once used for royal cloaks. The species is now extinct. In the 1980s, a lone male was recorded in the Alakai wilderness singing for a mate that would never answer. That tape remains one of the most heartbreaking sounds in ornithology. The island also hosted one of the strangest geopolitical fevers of the 19th century, the Russian Gambit. While American and British interests centered on Oahu, the Russian-American company set its sights on Kauai. In 1815, a German physician named Georg Anton Schäfer was sent to recover cargo from a shipwreck. Instead, he decided to play emperor. Why would a doctor think he could unilaterally annex a tropical island for the Tsar? The answer is likely a mix of ambition and heatstroke. Schäfer convinced King Kaumoalii that an alliance with Russia could protect him from Kamehameha. They built 3 forts, including the star-shaped Fort Elizabeth at Waimea, and Kaumoalii even pledged troops for a Russian conquest of the other islands. The scheme collapsed in 1817 when legitimate Russian explorers arrived and informed everyone that St. Petersburg had absolutely no interest in owning Hawaii. Schäfer was evicted. The forts were repurposed, leaving behind stone ruins and a bizarre footnote in imperial history. Today, Kauai allows Hollywood to dream of worlds that no longer exist. The island's prehistoric foliage stood in for Costa Rica in Jurassic Park, specifically the Napali coast and Manawaiopuna Falls. The modern reality is a mix of tourism and high-tech defense. The dry west side hosts the Pacific Missile Range facility at Barking Sands. The beach gets its name from the noise the sand makes underfoot. Due to the specific shape of the olivine grains, the dunes squeak when walked upon. It is a strange dissonance to imagine a place where the latest US radar systems scan the heavens for ballistic threats, while just yards away, the ground yaps like a chihuahua at tourists. I suppose I should visit, if only to verify the sound for myself, though I certainly hope the beach's bark is worse than its bite. Niihau, the Forbidden Isle's stolen voice. Having established my own failure to explore Kauai, I find even greater satisfaction in missing Niihau entirely. Most travelers count the countries they have visited, tallying up border crossings with the compulsive energy of a tax auditor, but I prefer a different metric. I have reached a level of sophistication where I cherish the places that explicitly refuse to see me, which makes Niihau a tremendous success. Rejection, after all, is the ultimate luxury. To be denied entry to the Forbidden Isle is to join a demographic far more exclusive than the people who actually live there. By never setting foot on its shores, I have essentially become a non-resident of the highest order. I am a distinguished ghost haunting the perimeter of a private kingdom that has successfully ignored a century and a half of tourism marketing. The history of this exclusion is a masterclass in long-term property management. In 1864, Elizabeth Sinclair purchased the entire island from the Hawaiian kingdom for $10,000 in gold, a transaction formalized under King Kamehameha V via Royal Patent No. 2944. Running the inflation numbers implies that purchasing a private island kingdom cost roughly the same as a mid-range Honda Civic does today. It is a realization that makes a person reconsider the efficacy of their own investment portfolio. The island remains in the hands of Sinclair's descendants, the Robinson family, who maintain a feudal serenity that is practically medieval in its effectiveness. The moniker Forbidden Isle wasn't originally a marketing gimmick to lure mystery seekers. In the 1930s, the family locked down the borders to protect the residents from polio and measles. They relied on the solid medical theory that if you refuse entry to everyone, the germs get bored and go elsewhere. Today, that quarantine has evolved into a strict policy where tourism is limited to helicopter landings on uninhabited beaches, ensuring that the only interaction outsiders have with the island is purely geological. This isolation has unintentionally created a linguistic Galapagos. Niihau is the only island where the Hawaiian language has never been deposed by English. It remains the primary tongue of daily life, spoken in a dialect called Olelo Kanaka Niihau that possesses a cadence and pronunciation entirely distinct from the standardized Hawaiian heard elsewhere. To keep this linguistic lineage from dissolving into the digital soup of the modern world, the language is taught to the younger generation at Kekula Niihau o Kekaha, a charter school on neighboring Kauai. Local culture also manifests in physical form through pupu lei, intricately constructed garlands made from shells so minuscule that stringing them forces the creator to confront the extreme limits of human patience and visual acuity. Long before the Robinsons put up the "Do Not Disturb" sign, the island functioned as a bustling waypoint for global maritime traffic. Captain Cook moved his ships here in 1778 after realizing Kauai's trading terms for yams were highly unfavorable. The most striking interaction occurred a decade later, involving the American ship Columbia Rediviva. On the 29th day of August in the year of our Lord 1789, Captain Robert Gray, a man of considerable enterprise and whiskers, did drop anchor off the arid coast. Upon this occasion, a youth of the island, known to the logbooks as Atu, was persuaded to board our vessel, ostensibly as a servant, though one suspects he simply wished to see what lay beyond the horizon. This nobility of spirit carried him all the way to the grim and blustery port of Boston, arriving in August of 1790. There, draped in the feathered cloak of his ancestors, he was paraded through the cobblestone streets like a Roman conqueror, whilst the Bostonians, having never beheld a man who had circumnavigated the globe from the Sandwich Isles, marvelled at his vitality. It is recorded by diverse sources that Yunga eventually returned to the Pacific, achieving the rare distinction of being the first of his people to tolerate a New England winter and live to warn others of the cold. Yunga eventually escaped the arid coast for the freezes of Boston, but the island he left behind remains permanently baked by the sun. Geographically, Niihau suffers from the misfortune of sitting in Kauai's rain shadow. Mount Waialeale greedily wrings out nearly all the moisture from the prevailing trade winds before they can cross the channel, leaving Niihau arid and prone to droughts that have historically forced residents to evacuate temporarily. Just to the north lies the crescent islet of Lehua, a seabird sanctuary where state officials recently declared victory in a localized war against invasive rats, turning the crater into a safe zone for nesting birds. The waters between Lehua and the main island function as a biological corridor for Hawaiian monk seals who use the area to forage and transit between the inhabited islands and the chaotic atolls of the northwest. These seals are endangered and entirely unbothered by human politics. They haul out onto the beaches without asking permission from the Robinson family, creating a rare overlap of jurisdictions. It is a striking contrast in territorial attitudes. The quintessential American tourist believes they possess a constitutional right to be everywhere at once. The Niihau resident quietly maintains that the only thing improved by being shared is a cold, and they aren't accepting those either. Maui hubris on Kahekili Highway. Knowing that the forbidden cliffs of Niihau were visible only to the privileged few or the historically fortunate, I turned my attention toward a more accessible, yet paradoxically more frustrating Conquest. Earlier, I alluded to my flight to Maui, a journey defined by a chess game that I won, though in doing so I seem to have lost the opening gambit of a happy marriage. I mention this tactical victory not to gloat over the defeated passenger, but to establish the baseline of unearned intellectual dominance I felt before immediately making a series of questionable decisions upon landing. We landed in Maui. We transferred to the Ritz-Carlton Maui Kapalua. I hate to be the grump in paradise, forecasting clouds over a sun-drenched itinerary, but the property felt like a significant step down from our earlier stay at the JW Marriott. I was disappointed. For reasons I cannot quite articulate, whether the humidity or the lingering guilt of the chess victory, I was incredibly grumpy. This dissatisfaction was particularly jarring given the island's history in the hospitality industry. Maui is the birthplace of the modern master-planned resort. In the early 1960s, Ka'anapali set the template on former plantation land. Planners integrated hotels and golf courses in a way that defined later developments like Wailea. Built in the late 1980s, the Ritz-Carlton at Kapalua inadvertently unearthed a massive native Hawaiian burial ground, Honokahua, during construction. The resulting protests forced the hotel inland. Despite this history of shifting earth and high stakes, my room simply felt tired. Seeking to banish this malaise, we drove to a nearby beach that was technically serviceable. We then attempted a snorkeling expedition at Honolulu Bay. That endeavor proved difficult. It was less a recreational swim and more a tactical assault on a gauntlet of rocks. They seemed designed by a vengeful geologist to break human ankles. It was a fitting introduction to the rough terrain of the Valley Isle. Two shield volcanoes, West Maui and Haleakala, formed the island. During periods of lower sea levels, these peaks connected to Lānaʻi, Molokai, and Kahoʻolawe in a super-island known as Maui Nui. Biological data and diverse species passed between them across temporary land bridges before the ocean rose to separate them again. The true highlight of our questionable decision-making was the drive. In a moment of hubris, I elected to take a shortcut to Kahului to avoid circling the island. We inadvertently found ourselves on the Kahekili Highway, In my memory, the route was a dirt road. I later consulted the cartographic records and discovered it is technically not a dirt road. It is asphalt. It is simply asphalt in the final stages of a terminal illness. The road narrows to a single lane and features sheer drops right off the cliff edge. It is a thoroughfare that demands a prayer with every turn of the wheel. The highway is named for Kahekili II, a figure who demanded equal respect. Before unification, he was the High Chief of the Kingdom of Maui, expanding a rival power center to Hawaii Island. By the 1780s, Kahekili controlled Maui, Molokai, Lānaʻi, and Oahu. He established a political hub in West Maui that challenged the rising Kamehameha I. The road reflects his historical reputation. It is unyielding and dangerous. If I had attempted this drive even a year later, my wife would have vetoed it immediately. Marriage eventually returns your survival instincts. She was terrified, yet we were in the early, blinding fog of matrimony. She told me later that she was so happy to be married, she did not care if she died falling off a cliff. The sentiment is romantic, but it raises deep concerns about her cognitive hierarchy of needs. As we navigated the terrifying curves, we passed the unseen history of Lahaina to the south. From 1820 to 1845, Lahaina was the royal capital of the Hawaiian Kingdom before the government moved to Honolulu. In the mid-19th century, it evolved into a rough port for Yankee whalers. Tensions between rowdy crews and stern missionaries frequently flared. This friction peaked in 1827 when the ship John Palmer fired cannon shots at a mission home. This legacy of wood frame buildings and dense history faced a modern catastrophe on August 8, 2023. A wind-driven wildfire devastated the town, making it the deadliest United States urban fire in a century. The historic banyan tree planted in 1873 showed signs of regrowth by late 2025, and the harbor eventually resumed limited operations. But the town we bypassed had been fundamentally altered by tragedy. We survived the drive. We only took that route once. The road to Hana is famously worth the effort for the 600 curves and 50 bridges winding through the rainforest, though I am sure it is overrun with tourists now. Yet, looking down from the terrifying solitude of the Kahekili Highway, the coastal towns visible near the sea were striking. They reminded me of villages I later saw in Tahiti. It was a drive that tested our nerve. It was a drive that proved the asphalt was mortal. It was a drive that confirmed love is deaf, blind, and devoid of vertigo. Kalawea, Kona, and the tamer tide. One survival instinct I lacked during our traverse of the Kahekili Highway, that asphalt tightrope aimed at turning tourists into reefs, was a proper appreciation for mortality. My wife pointed out this deficit while I buckled a car seat into a rental vehicle that smelled faintly of pineapple and defeat. "Do you remember the road that almost killed us on Maui?" I asked, testing the waters. "I try to forget the screaming," she replied, adjusting the rearview mirror with a distinct lack of nostalgia. "Well, good news," I said, channeling a level of you-learned confidence usually reserved for politicians. "We have a toddler now. The era of romantic near-death experiences is officially over." 5 years had passed since our brush with the abyss. The days of reckless cliff-edge navigation had been superseded by the arrival of a permanent travel companion I affectionately referred to as the party crasher, our son. Following a mandatory tour of duty at Disney Aulani, we decamped to the Big Island for our anniversary and checked into the outrigger Kona Resort and Spa. At the time, the corporate heraldry on the stationery might have been Marriott or Hilton. The logos blur together in the fog of sleep deprivation, but the architecture remains distinct. The structure is built like a bunker, It is a weird concrete wave of construction that feels less like a resort and more like a facility anticipating an immediate air raid. The property was fairly deserted, yet the setting was undeniably dramatic. The resort sits on lava cliffs with the sea crashing below, offering a front-row seat to the sunset, the VOG, a hazy atmospheric soup of volcanic emissions that acts as the island's signature potpourri, and the ghosts of history. On this youngest and largest island, the geological engine of the chain churns directly beneath the feet of vacationers sipping sugary beverages. Hawaii Island is a restless thing. It sits directly over the mantle hotspot, fed by 5 volcanoes including the active Kaulauea and Mauna Loa. Just off the southeast coast, the submarine volcano Kamehuakanaloa is busy building the next island in the chain. It currently sits about 975 meters underwater, patiently waiting for its turn to host a frantic real estate market. The resort is famous for manta rays that rise from the depths to feed at night, spectral gliders in the black water. I desperately wanted to swim with them, hoping to commune with these gentle fish in the glowing darkness. However, I possessed just enough paternal responsibility, along with a healthy, primal fear of the abyss, not to ditch my family in the pitch black to go play with giant sea creatures. Instead, we wandered into the recreation center one afternoon and witnessed a tableau that haunts me to this day. An older Indian man, easily 60, was playing ping-pong with a stunningly attractive Indian woman who looked about 24. They appeared to be newlyweds, and the dynamic was fascinatingly awkward. He seemed genuinely furious that he was losing, slapping the paddle with the petulance of a deposed king. It was clear to me that this relationship had the structural integrity of a damp paper towel. If it did last, I cannot imagine it was a very good one. Needing to escape the thick tension of recreational table tennis, we initiated a grand expedition across the island. Driving here is an exercise in geological time travel. We drove up to the Mountain Thunder coffee plantation, located on the slopes where the volcanic soil and cloud cover create the perfect microclimate for Kona coffee. The coffee was excellent, rich, dark, and complex. My son, however, was entirely indifferent to the world-class agriculture. He was absolutely enamored with the plantation's stray cat. We had traveled thousands of miles across the vast Pacific, traversing the curvature of the earth so he could pet a tabby that looked exactly like one we could have found in a dumpster in Dallas. We also made the pilgrimage to Kaulauea within Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. At the time, the volcano was smoking politely. It behaved as a gentlemanly geologic event rather than erupting violently as it has in more recent years. I have seen the YouTube videos of people getting pelted by bricks of volcanic glass and dodging massive lava plumes, and I am perfectly fine with having missed that particular thrill. The history of this island is as volatile as the ground itself. This was the cradle of the kingdom and the power base of Kamehameha I. Born in North Kohala, he built the massive Pu'ukahola Heiau in 1790 to appease the war god Kukailimoku. This construction was a strategic move to consolidate mana before launching his campaign to unify the archipelago. A short distance down the coast, Kealakekua Bay served as the backdrop for the end of Captain Cook. Arriving during the Makahiki season in 1779, Cook was initially received with ritual hospitality. A broken mast and a stolen boat eventually led to a skirmish where the famed navigator was killed, ending his third voyage on the surf-washed rocks. We hiked the park from the top down. The thing that strikes you about the Big Island is the aggressive geographical whiplash of the landscape. Traversing the terrain feels like flipping through channels on a planet simulator. You drive through desolate black lava fields that look like the surface of the moon if the moon had a highway administration budget. Then, suddenly, you are in a rolling grassland that feels like the American West. This environment is a nod to the island's paniolo, cowboy culture, established long before the Wild West was even a concept, thanks to Mexican vaqueros invited by Kamehameha III in the 1830s. Then, you turn a corner and arrive on the wet side, staring straight into rainforests and waterfalls. Geography acts as a hallucinogen here. The island is a disorienting, beautiful mess, much like the crumbling asphalt shortcut that almost killed us years earlier on Maui. This time, however, we were safely surrounded by a rental car with good airbags and a sleeping child in the back. Las Vegas, Hawaii's ninth island gamble. The aggressive geographic whiplash of the Big Island eventually gave way to a flight back to Oahu. Safely returned to Ko'olina, far from the stark lava fields and the defensive architecture of Kona, I was still adjusting to the manicured civility of a resort that did not feel like it was actively anticipating an air raid. I decided that cross-referencing the valet's vacation schedule with my own recent geological survey of the island chain was a critical step in understanding the geopolitical landscape of the Pacific. This was simply a sophisticated way of admitting I was stalling before we had to return to the room. While waiting for our rental car, I struck up a conversation with the valet. The friendly Polynesian man mentioned he had just returned from a trip to Las Vegas. I noted that I had once lived there myself, amidst the neon and the desperation. He nodded knowingly and called the city the ninth island. I asked why the desert held such gravitational pull for people already surrounded by the Pacific Ocean. He shrugged with the calm certainty of a man who has parked 1,000 Mustangs. "Hawaiians like to gamble," he said. This was not just a casual observation. It summarized a massive demographic shift. Las Vegas earned the ninth island moniker through a pipeline of tourism and migration so steady it practically counts as a tectonic plate movement. The origins of this phenomenon trace back to 1975 with the opening of the California Hotel and Casino. The property in downtown Las Vegas is affectionately known as the Cal. Sam Boyd, the founder, effectively decided to market a landlocked concrete oven to people living in a tropical biosphere. The strategy sounds like trying to sell imported sand to a beach resort, but in practice it was a stroke of commercial genius. When the hotel initially struggled, Boyd pivoted his marketing aggressively toward the Hawaii market. He offered charter packages with fares famously advertised as low as $9.90, a price point that today would barely buy a dry sandwich at an airport terminal. The hotel did not just ship people across the ocean. It tailored the entire baseline of the property to island sensibilities. The standard casino buffet was overhauled to offer aloha-style service and comfort foods like seimin and curry, replacing the usual dry roast beef and sadness found on the Strip. By the mid-1980s, the demographic shift was absolute. Hawaiians made up the majority of guests at the Cal. Boyd then expanded the strategy to sister properties such as the Fremont and Main Street Station. By 2006, the Boyd ecosystem was moving roughly 10,000 visitors from Hawaii to Las Vegas every single month. The physical infrastructure quickly followed the people. Hawaiian Airlines launched direct service between Honolulu and Las Vegas in 1985. This created an aerial bridge that made grandma visits to the slot machines both easy and frequent, a necessary outlet since gambling remains strictly illegal in Hawaii. The result is a surreal cultural annex in the Nevada desert, where the sensory experience is a hybrid of slot machine chimes and slack key guitar. Places like Aloha Specialties, a diner inside the Cal, became culinary embassies serving spam musubi to homesick travelers. This proved that the bond between a Hawaiian and their canned meat is stronger than any oceanic divide. Over time, the narrative shifted from recreation to relocation. As the cost of living on islands like Oahu skyrocketed, outpacing wages and sanity, the ninth island transitioned from a vacation spot to a primary residence. Families traded ocean views for affordable mortgages in Henderson and Summerlin, establishing one of the largest native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander populations on the mainland. The pipeline became so well established that following the 2023 Lahaina wildfire, displaced families utilized these deep networks to resettle in southern Nevada. Standing there in the humid breeze of Ko Olina, watching the valet retrieve a sedan that likely cost more than my first house, the connection made perfect sense. The ninth island is not just a place to gamble. It operates as a distant safeguard for the culture, located within a single day's flight of Honolulu. I thanked the valet for the insight and tipped him, realizing that in the casino of life, he was the dealer, and I was just looking to avoid snake eyes. Sweetheart Rock at Lānaʻi, Love and Undertow. For all the cultural weight of the Las Vegas Ninth Island phenomenon, that neon-lit annex of Hawaiian migration discussed with such reverence by the valet back on Oahu, I ultimately craved a gamble with better scenery and fewer slot machines. Some might argue that walking along an exposed cliff edge at sunset offers a poor return on investment compared to a buffet at the California Hotel. I headed south of Lānaʻi City anyway. The destination was Pu'upehe, or Sweetheart Rock. The sea stack rises 80 feet from the ocean like a crimson fortress, guarded by the churning surf and partially detached from the red bluffs of the main island. The islet is anchored in a story proving that the distance between romance and forensic negligence is often just a matter of marketing. Legend dictates that a warrior named Makakehau hid his wife, Pehe, in a sea cave while he fetched water. This domestic strategy backfired when a storm surged and drowned her. In a fit of grief, Makakehau climbed the sheer rock, buried her at the summit, and then leapt to his death. Most observers find this tale enchanting and frame it as a story of eternal love. I find it difficult to overlook the fact that if he had simply brought her with him to get water, they would both be alive and possibly enjoying a nice age-in-place retirement plan. Kenneth Emery, the archaeologist who scaled the rock in the 1920s using ropes and scaffolds, offered a colder splash of reality. He reached the summit expecting a tomb. Instead, he found a stone platform littered with the bones of seabirds rather than tragically deceased lovers. This evidence suggests the structure was likely a shrine constructed by bird catchers, an altar to the practical business of protein acquisition rather than a monument to bad babysitting. Today, the rock remains a sanctuary for wedge-tailed shearwaters. The birds nest in burrows near the path and are monitored by community groups during the fall fallout season, ensuring the fledglings are not disoriented by resort lights. I returned to the bluff for the sunrise, having successfully documented the sun going down the previous evening and feeling that a complete solar audit was required. The morning light illuminated the ruins of Kapiha'a village below the lookout. Stone remnants of house sites and fishing shrines illustrate how early Hawaiians balanced dryland farming with coastal harvesting long before the invention of the infinity pool. Satisfied with my documentation, I retreated to the room to change for a swim at Hulapoe Beach. Was my decision to enter the water on the western side of the bay a tactical error? Almost certainly. I claimed later that I was flanking the coral, but I had simply misread the geography. The Atlantic Ocean often feels like a large, indifferent body of water. The Pacific feels like a dominant personality with boundary issues. The waves arrived with a muscular insistence that suggested I was trespassing. Just near the tide pools at Shark's Bay, the current pushed me around with polite but firm aggression. The water was remarkably clear despite the churn, filled with crabs and fish darting among lava columns that form the remains of a collapsed volcanic crater. After surviving the ocean's attempt to evict me, we engaged in an aristocratic recovery method, a shuttle ride to the golf course clubhouse for lunch. The driver acted as a tour guide to the feudal system, pointing out that one could see Larry Ellison's house from the grounds. This allowed us to chew our food while looking down upon the landlord. We were joined by several brown anoles. They strutted among the tables, puffing out their necks in a display of confidence that suggested they knew exactly who owned the island and knew it was not us. Departing required a logistical pivot from leisure to labor. Leaving Lānaʻi involves a drive down Manele Road, the island's single paved artery, where we encountered a statistical impossibility. In a place with near-zero daily traffic, a heavy truck had managed to break down directly in front of us. We were forced to execute a tactical weave into the oncoming lane, dodging the island's solitary stream of vehicles to reach the airport. Once there, the security procedures confirmed the unique economic theories of small island aviation. We walked past the metal detector without so much as a beep or a pat-down. The prevailing logic seemed to be that hijacking a plane carrying 12 people offers such a poor return on investment that no self-respecting terrorist would bother with the paperwork. We sat in the small terminal, waiting for the propeller plane to ferry us back to the reality of connecting flights and the long trek to Chattanooga. From Lānaʻi to Chattanooga, a turbulent homecoming. I boarded the kerosene kite, my internal nickname for the commuter aircraft that combines the aerodynamic profile of a shoebox with the acoustic subtleties of a lawnmower. I felt curiously illicit after breezing through a security process that consisted entirely of a friendly wave. As we lifted off, I looked down at the majestic red cliffs and the Young Brothers Harbour, where barges were busy delivering the heavy necessities of island life, such as cars and bulk goods, in a slow-motion ballet of logistics. We shared the cabin with one other American and 4 Chinese nationals who spent the descent toward Oahu intently studying the landscape. I tracked their line of sight through the polycarbonate window, scanning the sprawling concrete of the joint airport airbase, and found nothing but the grim grey realization that military assets are the ultimate international tourist attraction. I could not help but wonder what impression that display of hardware made on them. Of course, I reminded myself that in the event of a nuclear exchange, that runway is the first slice of the pineapple to go. The morbid thought added a strange piquancy to the short flight. 20 minutes later, we touched down at Honolulu International. We were bundled into a van, driven to the terminal, and surrendered ourselves to the check-in counters of American Airlines. American Airlines, operating with a level of chaotic energy usually reserved for reality television, had reorganized our seating assignments. I suspect they had swapped the aircraft from a Boeing 777-300 to a 200. This downgrade necessitated the shuffle and required me to suppress a very specific type of first-world rage. We retreated to the lounge, a shared space with food that was surprisingly edible, offering a brief air-conditioned respite before the long haul over the ocean. We marched to the gate only to discover we were waiting for the aircraft to deboard, presumably having just arrived from Dallas-Fort Worth. We stood there for an hour. In hindsight, I should have remained in the lounge, as sedentary consumption of free cheese is my preferred state of being. Eventually, we took flight. I managed to sleep quite well, even though the seat in the 200 series was substantially smaller than the throne I recalled from the journey out. It was still acceptable. The primary advantage of this configuration is that it does not utilize a reverse herringbone layout, meaning I did not have to stare a stranger in the eye while trying to eat dinner. I consider this a victory for introverts everywhere. We were seated at a bulkhead, but unfortunately, the passengers in economy or main cabin extra, or whatever euphemism is currently in vogue to describe 3 inches of additional suffering, were seated immediately behind us. They promptly commandeered the overhead bin directly above my wife. They returned a couple of times to retrieve their items, which was irritating on principle. I must admit it did not disturb her. She slept through the intrusion with enviable focus. I woke up for breakfast after managing a bit of rest. We landed in Dallas, where we endured a delay due to mechanical faults that had to be checked on the vehicle. I generally support this procedure when I am sitting on top of the machine in question. Finally, we arrived home in Chattanooga, walking through the door just in time to deal with the medical logistics of our son breaking his arm. I tried to offer some fatherly wisdom about caution, but I suppose he just shouldn't have gone out on a limb. Hawaii, paradise forged by wayfinders and pineapple. Honor and parental pride swelled within me as I sat in a Chattanooga orthopedic waiting room, marveling at how perfectly we had timed our trans-Pacific return to ensure my son could successfully shatter his radius bone on local soil, an outcome far superior to outsourcing his skeletal demolition to a foreign emergency room. Avoiding the gaze of other parents who had similarly failed to keep their children in one secure piece, my mind lingered on the paradox we had just left behind. We buy into paradise as a marketing gimmick, an idea promising a static and waiting Eden wrapped in a glossy brochure. Yet the actual history of Hawaii is a chronicle of restless motion and aggressive pragmatism. The human story of the archipelago begins with a monumental maritime triumph, the deliberate settlement of an empty ocean. The islands were not populated by confused drifters bobbing on loose driftwood. They were mapped and colonized by Austronesian and Polynesian navigators who treated the Pacific like a readable highway. These seafarers guided traditional double-hulled canoes like the hokulea, using highly advanced wayfinding techniques, decoding star paths, ocean swells, and bird flight patterns to cross thousands of open miles. The bedrock they found was only a momentary pause in a geologic extrusion, while their human footprint was a deliberate mapping of blank water. Once there, they adapted to a profoundly isolated volcanic landscape trapped in continuous geological creation. To look at their complex agricultural terraces and fish ponds was to see a society locking ecological fragility into place, making liquid volcanic creation yield rigid sustenance as if stability were just another resource to pull from an unstable sea. The arrival of European explorers, notably marked by Captain James Cook in 1778, abruptly wired Hawaii into a sprawling global network of commerce and geopolitical rivalry. Before Cook bumped into the islands, they were largely ignored by Spanish Manila galleons that clung stubbornly to winds far to the north or south, remaining utterly isolated except for the occasional drift wreckage or disabled Japanese coastal vessel. Sustained Western contact quickly sparked an iron economy. Foreign captains desperately needed safe harbors and fresh supplies, and Hawaiian locals actively managed the exchange to extract nails, metal, and tools with the fierce enthusiasm of island chiefs stockpiling a newly discovered military advantage. It was a pragmatic and highly volatile mutual trade rather than a simple narrative of passive discovery. Local leaders observed this new influx of foreign technology and quickly decided to weaponize it. King Kamehameha I consolidated control over the archipelago by marrying traditional martial prowess with captured Western artillery. In a brilliant administrative move, he recruited stranded foreign sailors like John Young and Isaac Davis, employing them as military advisors with the sort of battlefield advantage usually reserved for imported mercenaries. The subsequent modernization of the Hawaiian kingdom involved a calculated internal political revolution, most visibly the dismantling of the strict religious kapu system in 1819. Powerful native figures, including High Priest Hewahewa and royal wives Ka'ahumanu and Keopuolani, assessed the rapidly globalizing economy and systematically abandoned the old gods to centralize their own economic power. During the 19th and 20th centuries, corporate agriculture completely re-engineered the landscape and forged a radically new demographic reality. Seeking maximum yields to satisfy foreign markets, agricultural enterprises carved vast irrigation networks across the islands. Men like James Dole converted entire land masses, such as Lānaʻi, into massive and highly disciplined plantation towns, producing sugarcane and pineapple. Managing these exhaustive crops required waves of imported laborers from Japan, Portugal, China, the Philippines, and Korea. This intentional labor migration permanently altered the social structure, organically forging a unique multi-ethnic local society. The dense proximity of these diverse communities gave rise to lasting social networks, hybrid culinary traditions, and the creation of Hawaii Creole English, known as Pidgin, bridging completely incompatible vocabularies. Eventually, the inevitable collapse of plantation agriculture forced another massive adaptation, shifting the land into an economy pinned heavily to tourism, real estate development, and a sprawling federal military footprint. As global competition made local crop exports too expensive, former cane fields were paved into luxury resort districts and strategic defense installations like Pearl Harbor. The state now operates under a continuous balancing act, holding up the heavy infrastructural demands of military readiness and millions of annual visitors while attempting to manage vulnerable natural resources. A nurse holding a clipboard finally stepped into the waiting room and called our name. We stood up, leaving my musings on paradise behind as we shuffled toward the casting room. I patted my son on his good shoulder and told him to look on the bright side of the plaster, pointing out that he now had a cast-iron excuse to avoid his chores. Lānaʻi wrapped up the way Hawaii itself tends to, gorgeous on the surface, complicated underneath, and somehow both more and less than the brochure promised, and getting back to a kid with a broken arm had a way of cutting through any lingering resort haze pretty fast. That tension between a single billionaire's vision of paradise and the aloha, Aina ethic of community stewardship isn't one that resolves neatly, and honestly, it shouldn't. If this chapter hit something for you, the full travelogue is waiting right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, The Papayas of Wrath. And if you want to go deeper behind the scenes with bonus content, come find us over on Patreon. Thanks for riding this one out with the Rise the Limit.